Jesus ends his night with the 12 in the upper room. Telling them some of the final things that he wants to share with them before he knows he's going to die on the cross. He shares with them his love for them, his concern for their unity, for their faithfulness, for the time that's coming when they're going to feel alone and afraid. But he tries to leave them with a sense of hope and encouragement that there's a better day coming. And then he ends that teaching in those last words with the beautiful prayer in John chapter 17 we read last week. And when that prayer had ended, he left to go do the will of the Father. This morning I want us to pick up there in chapter 18 and consider the betrayal in the garden, the night of his arrest. The first thing I want us to look at is the place. Beginning in verse 1, it says, when Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples over the brook Kidron, where there was a garden, which he and his disciples entered. And Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. Now, there's a couple things about these first two verses that I want us to kind of overview so that we get a good picture of what's going on, where we're at, in the context. When it says that he goes out, they don't mean he just goes out of the room. He leaves the city. He goes out from the city, and then he normally would go to Bethany, but being the preparation night and the Sabbath, Bethany was outside the distance where he would have been allowed and his disciples would have been allowed to travel by the law of Moses. And so the garden was most likely this enclosed, there would have been a wall around it, a private property, an olive grove, that was probably one of his disciples owned the property and allowed him and his other disciples to go there and use this as a place to rest and teach and that kind of thing. And so Jesus is familiar with this place. Judas is familiar with this place. His disciples are familiar with this place. And it's convenient to the city. It's still within the distance that they can travel. And so they leave the city limits. They go out and they go across the brook, Kidron, and they go to this walled garden, this olive garden, and they go in that night. Now, the first thing that I want us to consider is that going out. Jesus leaves, and where Jesus goes, his disciples follow. Right? Where Jesus goes, his disciples follow. Now, I want us to keep that in mind as we move forward in this story. When we talk about betrayal, when we talk about faithfulness to Christ, are you and I, as his disciples today, following him where he's going? Are we familiar with where he goes? Are we familiar with where he is and how he lives? Are we familiar with the place? So notice first the going, and then again this garden. This beautiful garden, this olive garden, it's a place of peace. It's a place of protection. It's a place of solitude. But it's also where Jesus goes. It's where he's at. And his disciples are familiar with this place. And so they leave the upper room, they walk out of the city, they cross the brook, and they enter into this walled Olive Garden. And then I want us to consider the pronouncement and what happens that night in the garden. John's account is a little different than the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But beginning in verse 3, it said, "Then Judas, having received a detachment of troops and officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, came there with lanterns and torches and weapons." So first of all, consider the posse that's gone out to get him, right? The Jews have conspired with Judas. Judas has agreed to betray him. Now, I've often said, and I was taught growing up that the kiss is the betrayal. The kiss is the identification of who Jesus is. And we're going to see how, here in a moment, that the betrayal was so much more than just him walking up and identifying who Jesus was. In fact, we go back to verse 2. Some of your translations, Mike Brown, I think the New American Standard says, "and Judas who was betraying him." Is that right? Judas was in the process of betraying Jesus. The kiss itself was just an identification. There's a whole lot more going on to it, and we'll touch on that more as we go forward in the story later on. But here, this posse comes from the Jews, from the chief priests, the Pharisees, with lanterns and torches and weapons. They come with officers. Now, these officers would have been soldiers of the Jewish court, but they also come with this detachment of troops. These would have been Roman soldiers. Now, a detachment of troops this size in Jerusalem at that time, there was probably about 200 men. Now, I don't think all of them went out with him, but there was a group from that detachment that went along, and I don't think they're involved in the arrest. They're simply there for what reason? They're there to keep the peace. They're there to make sure that things don't get out of hand. And so they're just kind of bystanders, all right? And so they get there. Now, understand again, this is a walled garden. It's walled off, it's protected. And they come to the gate of the garden, is what they do. And they come, and almost like a police officer would come to the door looking for a wanted criminal, and they'd knock on the door, and demand that the door be opened. If the person is there, that he show himself and come out, right? And so they come to the gate. Verse 4, Jesus, knowing that all things would come, went forward. Jesus goes and answers the door. He goes and opens the gate, and he asks them, who are gathered there at the entrance of the garden, "Who are you looking for? Who is it that you're here looking for?" And verse 5 says, they answered, "Jesus of Nazareth." And Jesus said, what? "You're looking at him. It's me." Now, it also says that Judas, who betrayed him, stood with them. So Judas is with them. Jesus answers the gate, the knock at the door, says, "Who are you looking for?" They said, "We're looking for Jesus." He says, "I'm him." Did they really need Judas to kiss him? To identify him? There's a whole lot more here going on in this betrayal. Verse 6. When they heard that he had said, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Consider the power of Jesus' words. Do the words of Jesus still have that power today? Do the words of Jesus still have the power to bring us to our knees today? At the speaking of his sonship, at the speaking of the fact that he was the I am, He was the Messiah. He was Jesus of Nazareth. They drew back and fell to the ground. And I can't help but think that Judas standing with them fell back and fell to the ground too. So they ask again. So he asks them again, who are you looking for? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. He said, I have told you that I am he. Therefore, if you seek me, let these go their way. So Jesus is still standing there at the gate of the garden talking to these men. I believe when you put the narratives of the synoptics together with this, it's at this point that Judas walks up and kisses him. And I felt like this for a long time, and this is just, I'm telling you, this is my opinion about this, because I wasn't there. I know you think I'm old and bald, but I wasn't there. I think at this point, Judas is starting to have second thoughts. And it's almost like Judas is walking up to Jesus and kissing him, saying, I'm sorry. But he's in so deep that he can't get out now. Or he doesn't think he can get out. But he's made a deal. And I will witness and I'll identify. So Jesus says, I am he, and Judas confirms it by going up and kissing him. But notice what Jesus says. I've told you that I am he, therefore, if you seek me, let these go, that the saying might be fulfilled which he spoke. Of those whom you gave me, I have lost none. In other words, if they hadn't let the others go, they may very well have arrested them too. They may very well have crucified them along with Jesus for being his nearest, closest followers. But this wasn't about them. This was about Jesus. It was about his crucifixion. It was about his death. As we talked about the first hour, it was about his sacrifice and his blood. So let them go. It's me you want. Jesus is handing himself over to them. Why? Because it's God's plan. Now understand again, in the narrative, what's already happened. According to the Synoptic Gospels, they've gone into the garden, and what has Jesus done? He's told most of them to stay there, but takes Peter, James, and John, and he goes a little further into the garden with them. Well, they're all out still by, at the front of the garden by the gate. He takes Peter and John a little deeper, and Peter, James, and John a little deeper into the garden. He goes off then and prays. And then he gets up and he comes back, and remember, he finds them sleeping. And then he goes back and he prays again the third time, and then he comes back and he says it's time to go. And so they go back and they join the others. That's where we're at in the story, right? Jesus already has prayed the prayer. Jesus has already decided, look, I'm willing to give myself over to do the will of the Father. So that brings us to the plan. In verses 10 and 11. Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Now again, the other Gospels tell us that Jesus does what? He heals Malchus, gives him his ear back. But, and this is just me being silly here, but Peter needed to practice some more. I mean, if he, not real sharp with it, cut his ear off. I mean, I don't know where he was aiming. But Peter, and I see myself there, right? I mean, if I love this man. He is my master. He is my rabbi. He's my teacher. he's everything to me, and now these men are going to try to take him and they're going to kill him. I think I'd probably want to defend him too. But Jesus looks at Peter and says, what? Put away your sword. Put it in the sheath. So notice first of all the cutting that takes place. Cutting is always a principle in the narrative of the gospel. We talked about it again the first hour in Acts chapter 2. When they hear the good news, those men on the day of Pentecost were what? They were cut to their heart. They were pricked in their hearts. Their hearts bled. Jesus' side is pierced. He bleeds. He sheds his blood. When Stephen preaches to the Jews, excuse me, they're cut to the heart. They're pricked. There's shedding of blood, but this isn't the kind of shedding of blood that's part of God's plan. Notice the cup. Jesus says to Peter, put your sword into its sheath. Shall I not drink the cup which my Father has given me? Again, what had he just been doing in the garden? He had been praying that, Lord, if there be any other way, let this cup pass from me. But not my will, but your will be done. And he gets up and he goes back to the 11. He tells them it's time. These men come to the gate. Peter reaches to defend and fight, and he says, put your sword away. The Father's told me I have to drink this cup. And I'm handing myself over. Just let these go. Now, what do we learn from all this? Or what applications can we take from this? Well, the first thing I think we need to take from this lesson is to be familiar with Jesus' patterns. Be familiar with Jesus' patterns. Be familiar with his life, his mind, his ways. Philippians chapter 2, verse 5, Paul writes and says in Philippians chapter 2, verse 5, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, right? I need to spend, I personally, yes, the preacher, I personally need to spend more time with the narrative of Jesus' life to understand who he is better. To understand his heart and his mind so that I can have the same heart and mind. I need to be familiar with the patterns of his lifestyle. How he talked to people. How he cared about people. How he served people. How he taught people. If I'm the only Jesus anybody may ever see, someone may ever see, then I need to be familiar with who Jesus is. But not only do I need to be familiar with the patterns of his lifestyle, I need to be familiar with where he is. The disciples, when they left that room with him that night, I think they knew where they were going. They knew that they were going to go to the garden because that's where they went. That's where they went to be with him. Even Judas knew that this was the place that they could find him with his disciples. Do you know where to find Jesus in your life? Do you know where to find Jesus on the Lord's Day every week? Will you know where to find Jesus Wednesday night at 6:30? Unless your water line breaks and you have to crawl under the house. It happens. Will you know where Jesus is tonight at 5 o'clock? Do you know where Jesus is? Are you familiar with who he is? Number 2, don't stand against Jesus' power. You can't. You can't stand against Jesus' word, against his power. Paul would write and say, I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation, unto all those who believe, to the Jews first and also to the Greek. We can't stand against his word. When he speaks, it will bring us to our knees, either now or in judgment. And better it be now than then. In Matthew chapter 12, verse 30, Jesus says, he who is not with me is against me. He that does not gather with me scatters abroad. How many of us today are standing or trying to stand against Jesus' power? We need to be brought to our knees, because every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that he is the Christ. Romans 14 and verse 11. Number 3. Stand behind Jesus' protection. You notice what happens when it's time to go? Those men with their lanterns and their weapons, they come to take Jesus. And who goes to the door? Who goes to the gate? It's Jesus. And the 11 are with him, but they're behind him. They're still within the walls of the garden. What's Jesus doing? He's protecting them. He's keeping them from the world. And when we stay within the walls of God's protection, when we remain faithful to him, he cares for us and he keeps us. In Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 5, the Hebrew writer said, don't forget, he has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. Right? Stand behind his protection. As Paul writes to Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 19, and said, the Lord knows those who are his. Put your faith and trust in the Lord. Stand behind his protection. And number 4, stop warring against Jesus' plan. How many of us this morning are trying to fight the plan of God? We're trying to war against what God wants. Christ finished his prayer in the garden that night. He was willing to do the will of the Father to save mankind. He knows they're coming. He goes, he meets them at the gate of the garden. He tells them, I'm the one you're looking for. And Judas continues to carry out his plot to betray Jesus. He kisses him, and they arrest him. But Jesus protects the others. But in the midst of all that, here's Peter trying to fight against God's plan. Every single one of us this morning needs to stand up here in a moment during this invitation song. And we need to consider, am I standing with or against the plan of God in my life? If I've never obeyed the gospel, as we talked about the first hour this morning, if I've never submitted to the good news of the salvation that comes by the grace, the blood, and the mercy of Christ, I'm fighting against God's plan for me. Why would I do that? why not submit yourself to God's plan and allow him to protect you and keep you